All right, let's go ahead and apply what we've been learning to spelling analysis. The next word is almost. The ball almost made it into the hole. Almost. Go ahead and say almost with me. How many syllables? 2. We will say to spell all most. What will we say to spell? All most. Let's sound it out together. The first syllable is all. Aw, use an a-a. Ul. The second syllable is most. M-o-s-t. Go ahead and write almost, sounding it out as you write it. All right, let's sound it out together. The first syllable is all. Aw, ul. The second syllable is most. M-o-s-t. And how will we mark it? We'll put 2 dots over the A to show it said its broad sound. Notice it's saying its broad sound before an L. We didn't learn that rule, but it often says its broad sound before an L. And why is the O saying its long sound? I and O may say I and O before 2 consonants. And there it is before 2 consonants. Let's read it. A, ul, o, st. Almost. Let's try the word alarm. My alarm went off at 6 a.m. Go ahead and say alarm. How many syllables? 2. We will say to spell a-larm. What will we say to spell? A-larm. Let's sound it out. The first syllable is A. A. The second syllable is larm. Ul-ar-m. Go ahead and write alarm, sounding it out as you write it. And help me to write it. The first syllable is A. A. Second syllable is larm. Ul-ar-m. How will we mark it? We'll put a line over the A. Why did it say its long sound? A, E, O, U usually say their long sounds at the end of the syllable. And in this case, it's in an unstressed syllable, so it's being lazy. And we'll underline the R. Let's read it. A-L-R-M, alarm. The next word is love. The kitten and puppy love each other. Love. Let's sound it out. Ul. Actually, with this one, I will tell students, say to spell love. I'll just exaggerate it. Ul, ah, v. Silent final E. Why do we have a silent final E? You're right, because English words don't end in V. Go ahead and write it, sounding it out as you write it. Let's sound it out together. Ul, ah, v. Silent final E. All right, how will we mark it? We'll double underline the silent final E. Why did the O say its lazy sound Well, it's next to a V, and O may say next to a W, T, H, M, N, or V. Why do we have a silent final E in love? English words don't end in V, so therefore add an E. How about the word notice? Did you notice that? How many syllables in notice? 2. We will say to spell no-tis. What will we say to spell? No-tis. Let's sound out the first syllable, no. N-o. Let's sound out the second syllable, tis. T-I-s. Use a k-s. And what will you need? You're right, a silent final E. Go ahead and write notice, sounding it out as you write it. And help me to write it. N-o. Second syllable is tis. T-I-s. Silent final E. How will we mark the word notice? Well, we'll put a line over the O. And why did it say its long sound? A, E, O, U usually say their long sounds at the end of the syllable. And k said its second sound, so we'll put a 2 over it. But why did it say its second sound? That's right, because of the silent final E. The C says because of the E. Let's read it. N-O-T-I-S. Notice. Great work. Once again, I hope that these rules and the phonograms are beginning to help you see these words in new ways. And I hope that spelling analysis is providing you a new tool to analyze words. So with all of the phonograms and spelling rules we've learned to this point, these are all of the words that are decodable. Decodable, that's right. Imagine how this redefines what makes a decodable reader. What makes a reader decodable is, do you know the phonograms and spelling rules in that reader? We can now decode 83% of the high frequency words. Okay, let's learn a little bit more because we're going to unlock them all. The next phonogram I want to talk about is the phonogram whir. Now, technically, a phonogram represents one sound. With Logic of English, we actually teach this as a multi-letter phonogram that says whir. Some programs teach this as a spelling rule. OR says after a W. That is just fine. When you are evaluating phonics programs or core reading programs, please don't evaluate it based on things like this. Like, there are different ways to teach the same concept. That is just fine. The question you want to ask yourself when evaluating a phonics program, though, is does this program explain most of the words, like 98, 95% of the words, or is it leaving thousands of exceptions? That's the question you want to ask. But exactly how it approaches the topic, that's not what's as important as are those rules consistent and explain the language well. All right, so whir shows up in words like words, work, and world. Another tip for helping students understand the spelling of words is to talk about how words are said in other parts of the world and to feel how the sounds are made. So I want to look at this phonogram. We've learned it as saying w. So go ahead and place your hands on your lips and say w. Notice your mouth starts round and it pulls back. W. All right, so when we say what, when, do you feel that motion? Now say who. You can feel that your mouth starts still who, rounded and forward. Okay, something interesting about this phonogram. In some parts of the world, this is said, or it's said what, unvoiced. Sorry, it's hard for me to say because in my dialect, I don't say it unvoiced. So instead of saying what, unvoiced, they say what, unvoiced. Do you hear that? What, when, whisk, wheel, and then who. So in that case, if it's an unvoiced sound, the WH in who is not an exception. If you say this as a voice sound, then maybe it's an exception, or you can explain that it is the same form and forward and round, who. So I'll leave that up to you as to how you want to see that, but hopefully you have an idea about how to explain it to kids, to explore how this sound is made, and to talk about how it's the same shape, but it is now unvoiced. And also listen for people who say what, when, whisk, and wheel. Another tip, as you teach the phonograms, is to teach the relationship between phonograms. We've been doing some of this. We've taught the relationship between AI and AY, between I and Y. Let's look at another pair. We learned that this says ow, o. This says ow, o, oo, That's right, it says 5 sounds. Ow, o, oo, How are these related? Well, they both say ow, o. And they also are somewhat related in spelling because English words do not end in U. So if you hear ow at the end of English words, it'll be spelled like this. OU we cannot use at the end of English words. We can also use morphology or meaning. we have this word you. And I recognize that it is ending in a U at the end of English words. We will come back to that. But in the word you, it's saying oo, right? It's saying ow, oh, oo. It's saying its third sound. What is it saying in your? It's saying oh. It's saying its second sound, ow, oh, your. You and your are related in meaning. And this is why some phonograms say more than one sound, because in order to retain that relationship in meaning, when we speak, we change the vowel sound. So if we spelled it exactly like it sounds, it wouldn't look like it was related in meaning. All right, this says A-E-I. Can you say that with me? A-E-I. This says A-E. What do you notice about these phonograms? They both say A-E. One of them says A-E-I, E-I does. But they share two sounds. Which one may I use at the end? E-Y. Because English words do not end in I, U, V, or J. So then I have the word they. Notice when it's spelling A, at the end of the word, I use the Y. What happens in the related word there? I use the related phonogram, but it's no longer at the end of the word, so now it's changed how it's spelled, but it's the related pair. Do you see that? Again, this is intentional in English, and it's part of how spelling is a balance between meaning and sounds. Another really fascinating concept is English, is the role that L plays with broad vowel sounds. So we have the word walk, talk, chalk. Notice the L is silent. However, the L in these words is telling the A that it's broad. So that's why the A is broad in walk, talk, and chalk. It's kind of like a silent E, but it's marking a broad vowel. The U often says its broad sound before an L too, as in pull, full, and difficult. And yes, you hear the L in these words, but oftentimes vowels will say their broad sounds before an L. What happens in could, would, and should? Notice the This is another spelling of the broad sound, could, would, should. And notice it has a silent L because it's saying that is the broad sound, much like walk, talk, and chalk. Another concept to know about in English are advanced phonograms. What is an advanced phonogram? Well, first we need to answer the question of what is a basic phonogram? Basic phonograms, such as the ones that we've been learning today, are found frequently in English words, or they explain high-frequency words. An advanced phonogram is found in advanced vocabulary, such as the PN in pneumonia or pneumatic, or they're not very frequently used in the language. I was interested to see that the word people is in the high-frequency word list of the 100 most high-frequency words as according to the Oxford English Dictionary, because we teach the EO in people as an advanced phonogram. It's not very common. However, you can always teach an advanced phonogram as a basic one. It's really just about order. And understanding the concept of a phonogram is really important because we know that the EO in people is saying the E sound. It's a phonogram representing a sound. So with all the concepts we've talked about so far, you are able to explain all the words in green. There are a handful of exceptions, but now you are able to explain 94% of the 100 most frequently used words. Let's now talk about the words with exceptions. I think some of you have been wondering, what about you and I? They end in I and U. Well, these are very old words. The interesting thing about English is one-syllable words are native English words and original to the language, and they have changed a lot over time. And as they change, they generate more exceptions. So the most common exceptions you're going to find in the language are in very small words. Multisyllable words are very regular. Well, you and I used to have other letters at the end, and they were dropped over time. So these truly are exceptions to the spelling rule. That said, they are not exceptions to the phonogram sounds. So you can decide how you want to think about that. There are exceptions to English words do not end in I, U, V, or J, but they say the sounds of their phonograms clearly. I like to teach them like this. You and I are very special, so we can end in you and I. Let's talk about the word of. With the word of, the F is saying the V sound. Now the O is saying its schwa sound, and of is one of those grammatical terms like the. So that sound is very regular. It's simply a schwa. I'd like a cup of tea. You can see how of is an unstressed word, and so it's saying But the F saying V is unusual. It's the only word in the language where this happens. What do you notice about F and V? V. Once again, they're a voiced and unvoiced pair. So maybe we used to say uff, and it changed to of. But it is an exception to the phonogram sounds. How about the word any? Which sound in this word is an exception? The A sounds like an eh. So instead of saying Annie, we say any. So that is truly an exception to the phonogram sounds. How about this word to? Which phonogram in this word is an exception? Well, there's a silent W. It looks like it says twu, but it says to. This word, though, is explained by morphology. Remember, English is a balance between sound and meaning. So spelling is trying to balance out retaining meaning and sounds. So let's think about some words with twa. When we have twins, we have two. When we do something twice, we do it 2 times. When there are 12, there's a 10 and 2 ones. 20 is 2 tens. TW means two in English. If we were to take away the W, we would actually break the relationship in meaning between these words. Also, I can imagine that at one time we used to say twu. When you teach the relationship in the morphemes and the morphology of English, it will help students to remember that two is spelled with a W. It'll also help them to know which form of two means the number 2. What about the number 1? Well, the O has a very strange sound in 1, right? So if in English, let's look at this morpheme again. If there's a lone bird, there's 1. If we're alone, there's 1 person in the room. If it's the only piece of candy left, there's only 1. So own means 1. Sometime the pronunciation of 1 changed probably, but we've retained the units of the spelling to show that it is related in meaning to these other words. So though it is exception to the phonograms, there is an explanation using morphology to both the numbers 1 and 2. So let's review these exceptions. We have you and I. They're decodable, but they are exceptions to the spelling rule. Of and any are exceptions to the phonogram sounds. 1 and 2 are exceptions to the phonogram sounds, but explained with morphology. So look at this. You now have the tools to explain all of these words. And what's also really interesting about this is all of these have, if you look, all the words that have exceptions only have 1 sound that's an exception. And so there are 362 phonemes or sounds in these words and only 6 exceptions to the sounds. And that is 1.6%. That's a true exception versus saying that's an exception 40 or 50 or 60% of the time. So So why should we teach students how to sound out the high frequency words? First of all, it is efficient. You can help students master more words more quickly than if you teach them just to memorize whole words. Also, this information helps them to read hundreds of thousands of additional words. And it aligns with the neuroscience of reading. I want to look at how our brains learn to read because this also helps us to understand why it is so important that we teach students how to sound out the high frequency or the sight words. So how does our brain learn to read? When we're babies, we learn to speak by being surrounded by language. We listen to the language that is being spoken to us. And babies have an amazing ability to discriminate all the sounds in the language. As they listen to the sounds being spoken to them, their brains begin to code the sounds. And what I want you to take note of is it decodes the sounds in this back left side of the brain. So it begins to code each of the sounds it's hearing. And then as the baby begins to know the sounds of the language and those are coded in the brain, they begin to connect the sounds to meaning. So the sounds b, a, ul, ball are then connected to the meaning that this is a ball. You can also see this happening in the brain. There's another area in the brain that codes for meaning. And there's linkages between sounds and meaning that you can see on functional MRIs of the brain linking the sounds ball to the meaning of a ball. Our brains are wired to learn to speak simply by being surrounded by spoken language. But is the brain wired to learn to read? And this is a very important question because many of us have been told or have been led to believe that if we surround kids with books, they will learn to read. And the truth is, and what is now known, is that no, the brain is not wired to learn to read. So surrounding kids with books is very important because it helps them to develop language skills. It helps them to love reading. It helps them to build their oral language comprehension skills when we read to them. But it is not going to magically teach them to read in the same way that they learn to speak. Something else that's important to ponder is that speech is the starting point for reading. Again, all languages, all written languages start with a spoken language. And speech is the starting point for reading. Reading is a reflection of a spoken language. This is how a strong reader's brain functions. And the first thing I want you to know is that the same area for sounds and the same area for meaning that are used when we listen and comprehend are used by strong readers. They add in two additional areas of their brain, a visual input and an area of the brain called the letter box. And then they reuse the part of the brain used for listening. And that includes both the sounds and the meaning. By contrast, a struggling reader does not use this area of the brain that a strong reader uses. A struggling reader uses the front right side of their brain. And it's really interesting to think about this because struggling readers are using a different part of their brain than strong readers. They're not accessing the parts of their brain that are related to oral language comprehension in the same ways. And it's also really important to know that with good instruction, the brains of struggling readers begin to look like those of strong readers at the same time as they begin to learn the skill of reading. So we can rewire the brain through good instruction. But how does the brain learn to read? Let's look at how the brain reads. Reading starts as a visual input, which makes sense, and then the activity in the brain moves to an area called the letterbox region, or the visual word formation area. So the letterbox is a part of the brain that says, hey, that's a letter, and that letter makes a sound. So the signal says that's a shape or that's a phonogram and it makes a sound and it goes to the sound area of the brain. the same area of the brain that you use to listen to language and the sounds of the language. And then they use those sounds, the auditory lexicons, to recognize the meaning of the word. Now, something else about the letterbox is that it only recognizes letters. It doesn't actually, it's a different area that's triggered for shapes. And so we'll explore that in a little bit. Let's instead look a little more closely at the letterbox region, or the visual word form area of the brain. So in the brain of a child or an adult who has not been taught how to read, so in the brain of someone who does not know how to read, the letterbox region is used for facial recognition. So the very same part of the brain that is key to strong reading skills is used by people who do not know how to read to recognize faces. And as someone is taught how to read, facial recognition moves to the right side of the brain, and the letterbox picks up a new skill, which is that it recognizes these are letters or phonograms that represent sounds. Something to keep in mind about facial recognition. Facial recognition means that you need to recognize that a mirror image is the same. So if you're a young child, you need to know that this is your mom and this is your mom. You wouldn't want these mirror images to look like different people. In fact, the letterbox region of the brain is the region of the brain that is the least sensitive to the idea that a mirror image is different. So what does that mean for emerging readers? It means these look like they're the same. So reversals is a part of learning to read and a part of learning to write. Reversals is not a sign of dyslexia. It is a part of training the letterbox region of the brain to recognize that mirror images represent something different. The best way to overcome reversals, research is showing, is by teaching handwriting. So how does handwriting help students? Handwriting helps students to figure out what are the important parts of a letter. So you'll see as this little girl is writing, she has an and it has a little bit of a bump between it. And what she's learning is what are the important components of a They've found that as students look at the letters, and they're very different as they're writing them in their own writing, there's variations, that's really helpful to the brain. The brain likes complex patterns. So here's how one researcher puts it. The motor experience of manually creating letter forms helps children discriminate the essential properties of each letter, which leads to more accurate representations, bolstering both skilled letter recognition and later reading fluency. So as you teach the letters, teaching the students how to write them is really helpful. And when you're working with young students, I'd like to say that you can teach letters using large motor movements, not only fine. Many students, young students who are ready to learn to read, do not have well-developed fine motor skills, but they can learn to write using large motor movements from the elbow and learn the shapes of the letters that then combine to make phonograms. So here's an example of a task that a student is doing that sometimes we don't think about. An n and a h are different. And they're different just based on the height of that one line there. And yet these two are both n's. How do we learn that? Well, learning it through writing and then through experiencing many shapes, many fonts of the phonograms is really helpful. So when you see various forms of it, you begin to learn what is important. Now, some of you may be thinking, gosh, this seems so hard for a young student. But here's what I'd like to say. The brain loves, loves, loves complex patterns, and the brain is so very good at it. So here's a complex pattern that 2- and 3-year-olds master that we often don't even think about. So this is a dog. Well, this is a dog. Okay, how does a 3-year-old or a 2-year-old know that these are both dogs? This is a dog. Okay, that's amazing. This is a dog. This is a dog. These are all dogs. Young children can recognize that these are all dogs. In the same way, they learn to recognize the phonograms that come in various fonts and have variations to them. And they begin to figure out, why is this a dog and not a cat? Or why is this an H and not a N? They begin to figure that out. And the brain is very, very good at this. Another thing to understand as you're teaching reading is that the letterbox region recognizes words regardless of case. So notice you can read this just fine. You don't, what this means is we are not reading the shape of words. We are reading phonogram by phonogram or sound by sound, and we recognize lower and uppercase letters when we've been taught them. So this sort of activity where you're identifying word shapes is not beneficial for reading. This is not useful. So if you are using activities like this, replace them instead with direct instruction in the phonograms and how they sound and how they're spelled. So if you have not learned how to read Chinese, when you look at this, your brain is triggering the area of your brain that recognizes shapes. If you have learned to read Chinese, your brain is triggering the letterbox. And then it's triggering the sounds and the area of meaning. So the letterbox is only sensitive to the alphabetic system that you have been taught. Something else that's super interesting to me is that that strong readers in every language use the same part of the brain. Neuroscientists have now discovered that once students know the letter-sound correspondences, emerging readers can self-teach fluency. So in other words, as a student is reading and decoding k, a, t, cat, st, a, n's, stands, as they're doing this, they are self-teaching fluency. What they see in the brain is that this pattern is being triggered, a visual input, letterbox, sounds to meaning. And as that pattern is practiced, the pathways get stronger and stronger and faster and faster and faster until something else happens. So as students practice and those pathways become stronger, the brain then begins to form a new direct route from the letterbox straight to meaning. Now, I want to be very, very clear. The brain, when it does this and develops reading fluency, is processing both the sounds and the meaning in parallel. Did you catch that? Our brains are so powerful, they can process the sounds and the meaning in parallel. So we don't skip the sounds, we do it in parallel. And the only way, or the best way to develop this pathway, is to practice sounding out words. So encourage your students to sound out words. Don't discourage it. It's practicing that again and again that will help them. Now, I also want to give you a tip. If your students are struggling to develop fluency, the question isn't and the speed in reading. The question you need to ask yourself are a couple. First of all, do they have strong phonemic awareness skills? Can they blend and segment multisyllable words and words? Do they have all the phonics skills? Do they have an accurate understanding of systematic phonics? Or do they have big holes so they're having to guess a lot? You can also ask questions about their auditory comprehension. Are they second language learners where it's difficult even to hear and comprehend? Because if that's true, they're going to struggle to read and comprehend. So those are some areas that you can look at if they're struggling to develop fluency. But beginning readers read serially, one phonogram at a time. I, at, had, oop, soup, or you get the idea. That is absolutely a normal part of learning to read and to become a strong reader. As students progress, reading serially goes away and they begin to process in parallel. So you see, I had soup for lunch, and you process it almost instantaneously. The meaning, you can hear the sounds in your head, meaning I had soup for lunch. You can hear the sounds of the words. So you process it in parallel. So what I want to hammer home for everyone is that advanced readers are processing in parallel. They are processing every phonogram and the meaning all at once, but they are not reading whole words. It is an illusion that people read whole words. It is really that the brain is doing these skills extremely fast and in parallel. And what makes the fastest change in the brain is teaching the grapheme and phoneme correspondences. In other words, what are the phonograms and what are their sounds? This is the fastest way to build these pathways in the brain. So I want to share with you a study done by Stanford that I think is very important for us to think about as we consider how to teach reading and how to teach the high frequency words. In this study, they taught one group of adults how to read in a new language by presenting them whole words. And they taught them to read the whole words as sight words. In a second group, they taught them to read the letter sound correspondences. And then they used those to decode words. Now, they tested the two groups, and they tested them in a functional MRI. And I think one of the really key understandings is that the group of adults who learned whole words used the front right side of their brain, the same side that struggling readers use. And the adults that used and were taught sounds and to sound out words connected into the sounds part of their brain and the meaning part of their brain and the letter box, and they use the same region as strong readers use. In addition, when they tested these adults, in group 1, they could read the words that they were taught. Group 2, though, could apply the concepts and read many additional words. So I think this study helps us to understand why we should teach students to sound out words. And it helps them develop the area of the brain that they need to become strong readers. And they are able to then apply that knowledge to read hundreds of thousands of additional words. And so just to make sure that you caught it, when a student learns a word as a whole word, if you're drilling whole words without how to sound them out, they are using and activating the front right side of their brain. Instead, we want to teach them to read using the language areas of their brain and to connect into that. So reading in all languages requires connecting letters to speech sounds and uses the same part of the brain. Once the letter sound correspondences are learned, emerging readers can sound out and understand the meanings of words. And they are then able to self-teach fluency. In addition, we know that teaching letter sound correspondences is the fastest way to acquire the ability to read and comprehend, which is what we want, right? We want all of our students to be able to read a text and comprehend what it says. This also connects in with the simple view of reading. And I think the simple view of reading is really powerful. It says decoding skills times oral language comprehension skills equals our ability to read and comprehend. So, for example, for many years, I studied Russian, and I am able to decode the Russian language. That said, I still have very weak oral language comprehension skills, so when people are speaking to me, I hardly understand what they're saying. Do you think I can read and comprehend in Russian? No. And the problem is my oral language comprehension. So weak oral language comprehension skills means a student will struggle with reading comprehension. Likewise, if a student has strong oral language comprehension skills, like Allie that I told you about earlier in this presentation, if someone with strong oral language comprehension skills has weak decoding skills, they also will not be able to read and comprehend. But when we teach strong decoding skills, what happens is that when their decoding skills catches up, they will be able to read and comprehend at the same level they can listen and comprehend. This is why Allie was able to go from not reading a recipe to reading a Nicholas Sparks novel or reading political science books in a very short period of time, because she worked on her decoding skills, and that was the missing piece for her. So the great news for you is that if you have struggling readers, they can listen to audiobooks. They can continue to build their oral language comprehension skills, and you can then strengthen their decoding skills by systematically teaching the phonograms and spelling rules that explain 98% of English words. And as those decoding skills catch up, they will be able to read and comprehend at the level that they can listen and comprehend. If you want to learn more about the simple view of reading, I highly recommend the Reading Lead Journal, Volume 1, Issue 2, May-June 2020. There's some great articles about the current research and the simple view of reading in this journal. So let's take a few minutes to recap. Today, we have learned how to logically explain how to decode the high-frequency words. These words are found in half of all English texts, and the rules and phonograms that we learned in this short session explains 98% of the words or the sounds. That's pretty amazing. And there are a few exceptions, but we can logically explain 98% of them. The ability to explain these words also helps us to explain the 1 million words that are in English. We are providing students the tools to decode and to spell any word. So I would like to encourage you to teach your students to sound out the sight words. Don't drill whole words, rather teach them how and why these words are spelled the way they are. This is the way that you can help your students develop the pathways that are scientifically known to be used by strong readers. I also want to encourage you to teach all the phonogram sounds. So don't teach only one sound of the vowels like a, ah. Teach all of the sounds. Teach ch says ch, k, sh. This is key to unlocking the code of English. Also, teach spelling rules that work. Teach phonograms and spelling rules that explain a majority, like 95 or 98% of the language. This will help your students to become strong readers and spellers. As you're teaching, too, I encourage you to draw connections with morphology. Show students how English is a balance of meaning and sound. This will help students understand words, build vocabulary, and be able to read and spell. I'd also think that spelling analysis is a great tool for you to use to explain words. So today we modeled how to apply the phonograms and spelling rules we're using to analyze how they're spelled and how they're read. And finally, we didn't get a lot of time to talk about this today, but I strongly encourage you to make learning fun. Learning about English is a joy, and it unlocks the rest of our education. And we can do this by playing games and doing this in fun and engaging ways. So thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that today's presentation has helped you to understand the English language better, given you some tools to teach the high frequency words, and helped you to envision a new way to approach reading in your classrooms.